Hello everyone, today we're going to explore one of the most transformative and tragic periods in modern history, the wars that forged modern China. Between 1927 and 1949, China endured 22 years of almost continuous warfare. This wasn't just one war, it was a collision of three powerful forces: the nationalist government known as the KMT, the Communist Party or the CCP, and the Imperial Japan. Over 20 million lives were lost in this crucible of violence. But from this chaos emerged the superpower we know today. This is the story of how modern China was literally forged in fire. Let's start with the context. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, China didn't transition smoothly into a republic. Instead, it fractured into what historians call the warlord era. Regional military strongmen carved up the country, and the central government existed mostly on paper. Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic, desperately sought help to reunify China. The Western powers weren't interested, but the Soviet Union was. In 1924, this led to the First United Front, an alliance between Sun's Nationalist Party, the KMT, and the newly formed Chinese Communist Party. In 1926, a young general named Chiang Kai-shek launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign to crush the warlords and reunify China. It was remarkably successful, but Chiang had a problem. He feared the communists were becoming too powerful. In 1927, everything changed. Chiang ordered what became known as the Shanghai Purge. In the single night of violence, approximately 5,000 communists and labor activists were killed. As Chiang himself warned, if their activities are not checked, they will bring disaster. The United Front collapsed. The Chinese Civil War had begun. For the next several years, Chiang hunted the communists relentlessly. By 1934, the CCP was cornered in Jiangxi province, facing annihilation. What happened next became legend. The Long March. 1 lakh communist troops broke through the nationalist encirclement and began an epic retreat. They marched between 3,700 and 12,500 kilometers. The exact distance is still debated, through some of the most brutal terrain in China. Only about 8,000 survived to reach the remote caves of Yan'an in northwestern China. But something crucial happened during this march. Leadership shifted from Soviet-backed urban revolutionaries to a peasant organizer named Mao Zedong. Mao understood something the Soviets didn't. In China, power came from the countryside, not the cities. Mao developed what he called the asymmetric warfare, drawing on the ancient strategist Sun Tzu. His famous doctrine: the enemy advances, we retreat; the enemy camps, we harass; the enemy tires, we attack. Trading space for survival, it was guerrilla warfare to the perfection. The communists were down, but they were not out. While Chiang was fighting the communists, Japan was carving up northern China. Since 1931, Japanese forces had been steadily advancing. Chiang faced an impossible dilemma. He believed in internal pacification before external resistance. In his view, the communists were a disease of the heart, an existential internal threat, while the Japanese were merely a disease of the skin, something to deal with later. Many Chinese, especially in the military, disagreed violently with this priority. In December 1936, everything came to a head in what's called the Xi'an incident. A warlord known as the Young Marshal Zhang Zhuliang was tired of fighting fellow Chinese while Japan advanced, so he kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek. The kidnapping forced Chiang's hand. To secure his release, he agreed to form a second united front with the communists. The civil war was paused. The war of resistance against Japan was about to begin. On July 7, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing escalated into full-scale Japanese invasion. Chiang made a fateful decision. Rather than retreat immediately, he would make a stand at Shanghai, China's most modern cosmopolitan city. He committed his best troops, German-trained elite divisions, to a brutal 3-month urban battle. Why? To draw international attention, to show the world that China would fight. It's been called Stalingrad on the Yangtze. The battle was catastrophic. Chiang lost 250,000 men, and critically 70% of his elite officer corps was destroyed. These were the professionals, the backbone of his army, but it did accomplish something. Japan's boast of conquering China in 3 months was exposed as fantasy. What they thought would be a quick war turned into an 8-year quagmire. Following the defeat at Shanghai, the Chinese army retreated in the chaos to the capital, Nanjing. The defense was disorganized. Defenders found themselves trapped against the Yangtze River with no way to escape. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Over 6 weeks, Japanese troops murdered between 1 lakh and 3 lakh civilians and prisoners of war. Tens of thousands of women were raped. The scale of the atrocity was systematic and deliberate. Japanese soldiers had been subjected to brutal training and indoctrinated with racial ideology that dehumanized the Chinese. The laws of war were completely abandoned. I should note that the international safety zone established by the foreign nationals in Nanjing saved thousands of refugees, a rare humanitarian bright spot in this horror. The impact of Nanjing was profound. It galvanized Chinese resistance across the political spectrum. Surrender was no longer an option. This was now a war of national survival. Chiang adopted a strategy of trading space for time. The KMT government retreated deep inland to Chongqing in Sichuan province, stretching Japanese supply lines to the breaking point. But this strategy came with horrific costs. To stop the Japanese advance on Wuhan, Chiang made one of the most controversial decisions of the war. He ordered the Yellow River dikes destroyed. The resulting floods stopped the Japanese advance for months, but the human cost was catastrophic. Between 5 lakh and 9 lakh Chinese civilians were killed by the floods. Millions more were left homeless. As one of the Chiang's advisors grimly noted, it would be best to make the utmost effort to stomach Japan, meaning accept any cost to slow them down. This was total war at its most desperate. From 1938 to 1941, the war reached a brutal stalemate, but the two Chinese factions, the KMT and the CCP, had very different experiences. The nationalist government in Chongqing was subjected to the world's first strategic terror bombing campaigns. The city was bombed relentlessly. The economy collapsed into hyperinflation. Corruption became endemic. Conscription was brutal and heavy-handed. Adding to Chiang's humiliation, one of his senior officials, Wang Yanwei, defected to lead a Japanese puppet government. The communists in Yan'an, meanwhile, were having a very different war. Operating behind Japanese lines in guerrilla base areas, they expanded their control steadily. Mao famously allocated his resources this way: 70% expansion, 20% dealing with the KMT, 10% resisting Japan. In other words, the communists were using the war to position themselves for the future. They did fight. In 1940, the CCP launched the 100 Regiments Offensive, a rare large-scale attack that destroyed Japanese infrastructure, but mostly they focused on winning peasant support and building their strength. Meanwhile, Mao consolidated power through the Rectification Movement of 1942, which established Mao Zedong's thought as the party's political ideology. Two Chinas were emerging from the same war. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, China's war became part of World War II. China was now officially allied with the United States and Britain, but it was a deeply dysfunctional alliance. The relationship between Chiang and the American commander Joseph Stilwell was toxic. Stilwell, nicknamed as Vinegar Joe for his bitter temperament, called Chiang the peanut behind his back. Stilwell demanded operational command of Chinese forces. Chiang demanded supplies and respect. Neither got what they wanted. Look at the resource asymmetry. In 1941, Britain received 821,000 tons of American aid. China received just 16,000 tons. Chiang felt justifiably that China was being treated as a second-class ally. Burma, the main supply route to China, fell to Japan. The famous Burma Road was cut. China was isolated, exhausted, and running on fumes. In 1944, Japan launched its last major offensive, Operation Ichigo. 500,000 Japanese troops mashed through nationalist lines to link land routes to Indochina. It was a disaster. Nationalist armies collapsed. The operation revealed just how hollow and exhausted Chiang's military had become. American confidence in the KMT evaporated. At the same time, American observers visited the communist base in Yan'an on what was called the Dixie Mission, named because they were visiting rebel territory. What they found surprised them. The American reports described the communists as disciplined, democratic, and less corrupt than the nationalists. This created a diplomatic opening for the CCP and planted seeds of doubt about America's ally. The contrast was stark. The nationalists were collapsing while the communists appeared vigorous and organized. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. China had won. But what kind of victory was it? In the final days of the war, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and destroyed the Japanese Kwantung Army in a week. Then Stalin did something crucial. Soviet forces stripped Manchuria's industrial infrastructure, but they allowed the CCP to secure vast stockpiles of Japanese weapons, rifles, artillery, tanks. The United States airlifted nationalist troops to key cities to prevent communist takeover. The race for territory was on. American General George Marshall was sent to broker a coalition government. He tried to get both sides to share power. It failed completely. Neither side trusted the other. Both used the truce to reposition forces for the resumption of civil war. On paper, the nationalists had overwhelming superiority, 4.3 million troops versus 9 lakh communists, but only KMT. But many KMT units were hollow, demoralized, poorly supplied. The CCP forces were smaller but highly cohesive and motivated. The stage was set for the final act. Full-scale civil war resumed in 1946. Chiang's strategy was conventional: seize the centers of gravity, cities, railways, strategic points, control the key terrain, and the war is won. But this overextended his forces. Nationalist garrisons became isolated. Armies were stuck defending static positions. The KMT even captured Yan'an, the communist capital, but found it empty. Mao had already evacuated. The communists meanwhile used Mao's old doctrine: abandonment of territory is necessary. Stretch the enemy, bleed them through 1,000 cuts, control the countryside. And economically, the nationalists were imploding. By 1948, hyperinflation in KMT-controlled cities reached 300% monthly price increases. The urban middle class, the KMT's natural base of support, was being destroyed. In 1948, everything came apart for the nationalists. Three massive campaigns sealed their fate. The Liaoshun campaign in Manchuria, 470,000 KMT troops were killed, captured or defected. Manchuria, China's industrial heartland, was lost. The WWII campaign, this was the largest battle since World War II. 555,000 nationalist troops were lost in a single campaign. Something fundamental had shifted. The People's Liberation Army was no longer fighting as guerrillas. They were conducting conventional warfare using captured artillery and armor. They were outfighting the nationalists in set-pieces battles. And critically, entire nationalist units were defecting to the communists. The collapse wasn't just military, it was moral. The end came swiftly. In January 1949, Beijing fell. In May, Shanghai, the symbol of nationalist power, also fell. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The Chinese people have stood up, he declared. Chiang Kai-shek, along with about 2 million soldiers, officials, intellectuals, and refugees, fled to Taiwan. They took China's gold reserves with them. In the United States, the loss of China triggered political firestorms. It reshaped American foreign policy for a generation and helped launch McCarthyism. The stage was set for Cold War confrontation in Asia. Let's talk about the legacy a bit. The human cost was staggering. Over 20 million Chinese died in World War II alone. Millions more died in the Civil War and from famine. The biological warfare experiments of Unit 731 left scars that remain. But from this destruction came rejuvenation, at least in the communist narrative. The century of humiliation was over, China was unified and independent, yet the war never technically ended. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the US 7th Fleet was positioned in the Taiwan Strait to prevent a communist invasion of Taiwan. That frozen conflict persists to this day. There are still two Chinas, the People's Republic on the mainland and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And here's what's crucial to understand about modern China. The narrative of national humiliation and rejuvenation isn't just history, it's the core of Chinese national identity today. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests on having ended the chaos and weakness of this era. The wars between 1927 and 1949 didn't just create modern China geographically, they created its psychological and political DNA. Thank you for watching, and I hope if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. Do pass your comments below. Thanks for watching.